Over the past several years, many of us have argued that EVs are going to displace legacy autos or internal combustion engine vehicles. But there's something I hadn't really taken account of that's going to make this switch much more drastic. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I can't take credit for the original idea of this. This was actually Andrew on Twitter that alerted me to this, and thank you very much for, private messaging me about this because it's actually something really, really fascinating. And what it is a part of the adoption curve for automobiles specifically that is going to make the transition happen even faster than everybody is predicting. And it's something that the people who are designing and developing and selling vehicles in the United States and in Europe and in China and the rest of the globe are probably not paying enough attention to. If they are paying attention to this factor, then they're, I'm sure, staying up at night. They're not getting any sleep. So anyway, let's take a look at this. I'm going to start with the now famous S-curve that probably most of you know about. That is the way that technologies, disruptive technologies, are adopted over time. So you can see across the horizontal axis down here, we've got time. The vertical axis is how much percent of the population has actually adopted this new technology. And so you can see down here at the very beginning, it takes a very long time. You've got innovators who are the people who develop this new technology. And then you've got early adopters. And that's about the first 10% or so of the people who buy this new technology or whatever this disruptive technology is. And then right about here where this square is, right around the 10% mark, is where we flip from the early adopters, who are people who are just, chasing technology. They'll pay more money than something is worth. They'll deal with the pain of it not working quite right. They'll deal with a lot of the, the foibles of a new technology because they're early adopters and they're excited about the new technology and the prospects of it for the future. But around the 10% mark is where you start into the early majority. And then of course you get this S-curve turns very close to linear across time through the early majority into the late majority. And then you get to the laggards. And those are people who are just like, nah, I'm not going to get this, right? If you think about cell phones, there's still probably people that have like flip phones or even potentially some people who don't have any cell phones at all. So as opposed to the majority who eventually purchased a smartphone after the Apple iPhone and the Android phones came out, there are still a group of people who haven't done that yet, but that's shrinking over time. And if you look at this, the early adopters, the amount of time the early adopters spend, generating a new technology, the innovators and early adopters, that timeline is actually a little bit shorter than the laggards because you can see that the laggards could, it could take years for them to get that. But the interesting part for us here is this middle 80%, right? So you've got the 10% at the bottom, where you've got your early adopters and they're doing their thing and things are relatively slow. And then you've got your laggards and that's the last 10%. But that middle 80% goes relatively quickly. So once the technology hits that 10%-ish tipping point, that's when it takes off really, really fast. So now let's take a look at some real world examples. This is from Michael Felton with the New York Times. This is a really, really useful graph. You can see things like the automobile. You can also see, you can see that was kind of an S-curve, but it got really, really flattened out over time because the 1930s happened and the Great Depression. So it was really following the S-curve until the Great Depression happened and then World War II happened and then it picked back up again. But it took a long time. But as you march towards the right, towards more recent technologies, you can see things like color televisions. If we approximate where the 10% mark was, it's somewhere around here. So say 1967 or so, and you get up to the 80% mark and you're looking at 1980. So you're looking at maybe 13, 15 years to be very generous to go between 10% and 80%. So that's getting a lot faster, right? You're seeing things happen much more quickly. And then if we get to the cell phone, if we kind of guesstimate where the 10% mark is here, maybe the early 90s, 92, 93, 94, something like that, and we get to the 80% mark, you've got 2005. So again, we're looking at something that's just over a decade, maybe 12 years or so in that 10% to 80% range. And in this slightly less busy graph, we can also look at the same thing happening here, right? You can see things like cell phones taking off again from the 10% mark, early 1990s to the 90% mark around 2005. So again, that's 10% to 90%. That's that middle 80% that happens in just over a decade. You can also see that even something like the VCR, although it collapsed eventually because it was was taken over by things like the, DVD player and stuff and streaming eventually. But that had a very, very rapid ramp as well to just about 90% before it collapsed. And actually the VCR brings up a really, really interesting point. And that is that the old disruptive technology follows a flip-flop version of this curve. In other words, the VCR, took off and it got to like 90% saturation. Then the DVD came in and the DVD caused the VCR to fall in an S-curve downwards as well. So at the beginning, it fell rather slowly and then it accelerated and it fell very, very quickly. And then there was a tail to it until it was just nobody produced it anymore because it wasn't economically viable to do so. And of course, many people, including Tony Seba and Kathy Woods and others, have predicted that automobiles are going to follow this, right? You've got electric vehicles or EVs that started slowly. They've hit the ramp curve. They're getting to the 10% plus area, right? They're getting to the steep part of the curve right around now, depending on where you are. The United States is a little behind. China is very much in the forefront. Europe is somewhere in the middle of that. And so these major markets, they're hitting that 10% mark in the last couple of years. The US probably should be around 10% this year. Anyway, once it hits that part, we're looking at, they're saying like a decade-ish, 12 to 15 years or something to make the transition. But there is a factor that I don't know that people have taken account of enough yet. And that is the cycle time of purchasing a vehicle. So if we take, historically somewhere around 80 million vehicles are sold per year out of a fleet of somewhere over 1 billion. So, let's just rough numbers, call it 10%. It's not exactly, but anyway, let's just call it 10%. So 10% of the fleet of vehicles turns over every year. But what happens is the average person who buys a vehicle keeps that vehicle for around 5 to 7 years. And especially with a recession on, people are going to be much more likely to keep their vehicles for longer because it's cheaper than buying a new vehicle. So this is only going to exacerbate this situation. But basically, if you're looking at an adoption cycle that could happen between 10% and 80 to 90% on the order of 10 to 12 years, that's only 2 purchasing cycles. That means like one today and then one somewhere around the mid 2020s or so, right? So 27, 28, 30, maybe something like that. So somewhere in that range, a half a decade plus a little bit before somebody purchases the next vehicle. And then the next time they're purchasing that vehicle after that is going to be well into the 2030s, like 2035, 2036, somewhere in that range. So what does that mean? That means if 10% of vehicles are purchased this year, that 10% of vehicles is out of the market for the next half decade at least. Again, statistically, some people like to purchase cars every other year, things like that. But I'm just saying statistically, and this is what matters. So every single person who buys an EV this year, again, statistically, those people are out of the market for legacy vehicles until somewhere around 2028, 2029, 2030, somewhere in that range. And that means that Legacy Auto does not have access to that group of people purchasing vehicles again until a long time from now. And if we look at these disruption technology trends and we look at the adoption curve, in 7 years, 6 or 7 years, we could easily be somewhere in the 60 to 70% adoption rate, at which point people will look at vehicles, especially if they've purchased an electric vehicle already, they're going to look at the ICE options. They're going to be more expensive to purchase by then, almost definitely, and they'll be more expensive to maintain, and it will be it would be kind of an illogical conclusion for somebody who's driven an electric vehicle for 5 or 6 or 7 years to want to go back to internal combustion. So you're taking people out of the market. Every single person who purchases an EV now is out of the market for that car for the next half decade plus. And when they look again, it's incredibly unlikely that they're going to want to go back to an internal combustion vehicle. Now, again, I'm talking statistics. There's always going to be the 1 or 2 people who are like, oh, hate the electric car, going to go back to an internal combustion car. But that's not going to be enough to make a difference. So what we're looking at is the fact that we've got these cycle lives. The purchasing cycle life of vehicles is very long. long compared to something like, take a cell phone. A lot of people replace their cell phone every 2 years. I think that's about the average. So that happens much more rapidly. So you could say, if Samsung misses a sale this year, then they will have an opportunity to sell to that person 2 years from now. But if an automobile manufacturer misses a sale this year to another company, or again, a legacy auto like an ICE manufacturer loses that sale to an EV manufacturer, that means that they're going to lose that sale opportunity for a half decade plus. That is a really, really long time when disruption is happening. So, of course, a couple of assumptions here. Number one is that we're going to look at the disruption of a major, very expensive thing happening at the same speed as relatively inexpensive items like phones, television sets, computers, stuff like that, right? VCRs. But a lot of these were very expensive in the early days. I remember a friend of mine, my girlfriend, in fact, back in 1982, she was the first person that had a VCR. And I think that thing was somewhere around $2,000 when they purchased the VCR. And I remember purchasing a CD player a couple of years later, somewhere around that area, maybe 1984, something like that. And that was about $1,500, maybe it was $1,200, $1,500 to purchase the CD player to listen to music on, right? And of course, we're talking 1980s dollars, so it's a lot more expensive than that right now, relatively speaking. So this was a huge chunk of change to get in on this new technology. And of course, a lot of this technology was not strictly necessary. You don't have to have a CD player. You don't have to have a VCR. You don't have to have a color television as opposed to a regular TV, etc. Whereas you can make a much more strong argument that people in general need automobiles unless they live in a city with really good public transportation, which in a lot of places doesn't exist. So you really do have to have at least one vehicle for a family in order to get by. So it's a pretty necessary purchase given the way that the world operates these days. And at the same time, it's a huge purchase so that people don't make that purchase very often. I'm sure you can go back in your life, even if you've lived as long as I have, and you can remember every single car that you purchased, whether you bought them new or used or whatever. It was infrequent enough that you can remember the cars you purchased. And that means that this is the kind of thing that, again, is a major undertaking financially every single time you do it. So what that means is that once somebody's bought something, there's a real lock-in. This is something that I'm sure companies like Apple and Samsung and stuff wish that they had more of. I mean, one of the reasons you keep buying Apple's products is because there's a tie-in. There's a kind of an ecosystem where you're kind of locked in. But when you purchase an automobile, you get that automatically. So I think from the demand side, I think there's definitely the demand that can cause EVs in 10 to 15 years to go from that 10% to 80 to 90%. I think that's definitely, it's probably already almost there if it's not there already. The bigger sticking point is how fast can Tesla and other EV manufacturers make these vehicles? That's going to be a bigger sticking point in my mind. If you can't fill the need for these cars, then you can't replace them fast enough. And again, the same thing for Tesla or any other EV manufacturer. If people are like, oh, I'd really like to buy a Tesla, but I can't get it right now, and or some EV, but they're just not available, I'll just go ahead and buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. If people do that, then the same thing holds for the EV company, which is that person is taken out of the market for several years. And this takes us to the rather genius move that I think that Tesla has done recently with the price cuts. Their price cuts are so aggressive. And again, people were like, at the beginning, they were freaking out. They were like, oh my gosh, no demand. What are they going to do? They're not going to be able to, be able to hold prices. They're not going to be able to have profit margins. Many people have examined it and they've said, look, Tesla's going to make good money anyway. They make money on software. Their margins might fall from the mid to high 20s to the low 20s or maybe the upper teens, but they're still making money on every car, so who cares? What they are going to do, however, is manage demand. They're going to basically sell every car they can make. So that means that the more cars they make, the more cars they sell, and every single one of those vehicles that they sell is, you can just check it off the market. You can check that off for any other manufacturer to make, and in particular, internal combustion engine vehicles. Those guys are losing sales directly to Tesla and to the Ford Mach-E and the F-150 Lightning and the BYD cars and the VinFast cars when they're around, and on and on and on, and VW and all these other companies. Every single one of those electric vehicles that these companies are selling is one more vehicle you're taking off the market for at least a half a decade. Statistically relatively speaking, again, and that's a sale opportunity that is lost for all of these companies. So if a company like Volkswagen is losing sales right now and you see their sales declining, they're not going to get that back next year because those people are gone. They're not going to purchase another vehicle next year. They're going to wait a half decade plus before they look at purchasing another vehicle. So those sales are gone and gone for a long time. At the exact same time that you got this massive S-curve adoption, right? You're hitting the straight steep part, and the double whammy of that is what's going to actually completely bury legacy auto or anybody else who doesn't keep up right now. I mean, we could also say companies like Lucid or Rivian that make good quality EVs, but they can't meet demand. What they're going to do is they're going to lose out on those sales, and people who might want to buy that car, if they can't get it fast enough and for the price they want, if they don't purchase it now, it's going to be a half decade before they're interested in purchasing that car again. So, all of this, it's not just legacy auto, it's anybody who can't create enough vehicles right now. And that's where Tesla is like, Elon's right. They're a shark right now. They're like, we can produce more EVs than anybody else. We're going to produce more EVs than anybody else. We're going to sell as many as we possibly can. And that is going to essentially eat everything else in the market. This is a zero-sum game, ultimately, right? There's only so many automobiles that the world needs. It's kind of stabilized. It's somewhere around the 80 million mark. It's actually a little bit less than that now. But that's a fairly stable figure. And so every bit that they can sell, if they can sell 1 million EVs in a year, that's 1 million vehicles that nobody's going to be looking to purchase again for the next 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. If next year, as expected, Tesla sells 2 million vehicles, that's 2 million vehicles that nobody's going to be looking to purchase for the next 5, 6, 7 years. And all the while, as people are not purchasing cars, everybody else who's purchasing an EV is helping that adoption curve go up that S curve and climb that ladder. And that means that the next time a person is interested in purchasing a vehicle in the later part of this decade, they're going to look around and they're going to say, the sticker price of an EV is cheaper. I've already owned an EV. It costs very, very little to maintain compared to my old ICE cars. It doesn't cost nearly as much to charge up versus fueling. Many, many advantages to it. It also lasts better. It doesn't have, it doesn't just get old and worn out, and it could probably drive longer. So really people could even own it for longer. But anyway, the resale value is probably going to be better as well. So many, many things are going to accumulate, which means that the next purchase of that vehicle, that person's vehicle, is more likely to be an EV than last time. So that's just, it's just a positive feedback cycle. And what that ultimately means is that while this adoption is happening, the collapse of legacy auto non-EV cars is going to happen faster than people think. It could actually happen faster than the adoption rate of the EV. So what we could be looking at is if there is a huge amount of demand for EVs, but not enough production, people will actually wait. And that's called the valley of death. You've got the demand for EVs rising and auto manufacturers can't make enough of it. And so you'll actually get this divot, you'll get this dip where there's not enough EVs to meet demand, and people won't replace those EVs eventually with gas cars. So they just will wait. They'll hold off until they can get an EV, which means that you could actually see the decline of internal combustion engine vehicles much faster than the adoption rate of EVs. And that should be keeping legacy automakers up at night. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and interesting and thought-provoking. I would be really interested to know what you think about this in the comments. Maybe you think I'm crazy. Maybe you think that this is going to go slower than 10 to 15 years, and you think there's going to be multiple cycles of people buying in the meantime. Maybe you think that, especially in the United States or something, people will be like, you can pry my gas engine from my cold, dead hands kind of thing. That could be possible. There could be people who will do that, but I would say that the economics of the situation are such that at some point it's going to become too expensive to build internal combustion vehicles. And when that happens, nobody's going to have a choice. It'll just cost too much money. So yeah, there could be niche markets where there could be like high-end, unusual vehicles, but it'll be like horses. There are still horses around, but they are not the major mode of transportation anymore. They are a fun thing. They're a niche thing that people do to enjoy themselves rather than to actually transport themselves around. But what I'd really like to know in the comments is what you think about how fast the gas demand curve will drop off. Is it going to go in perfect lockstep with EVs, or are we going to see the demand drop off faster than EV adoption because of the fact that the cycle time of buying is so long that once people purchase an EV, again, the likelihood is they will probably not ever purchase another internal combustion engine vehicle to replace that one. Again, if you have 2 or 3 cars in your family, you might replace one at a time over several years, but that particular vehicle, if it's gone out of the market, is probably gone forever. It's not going to be something where you're going to replace it with an internal combustion engine ever again. And so at least in my mind, the demand for gas cars is going to drop faster than EV adoption. But anyway, I really do want to find out what you think about that. Maybe you think I'm crazy, or maybe you think that this is like kind of a genius thing. Again, this was Andrew. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I thought it was a really, really excellent point and worth a video to talk about. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please do like it, because that's the way other people find out about the video on YouTube. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all so much for your support. I truly do appreciate it. And of course, if you want to join the team, just check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have Tesla Bot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, success is a possible outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on and on. So check it out. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how going shopping for a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.